Some viewers asked me to do a video about maybe the most influential and one of the most controversial public intellectuals of today, Jordan Peterson. And so I'll try to do that today. First, why is Jordan Peterson so popular? One reason is that he focuses on self-help. And this is one of the most successful media genres we have today, right? Books, videos, and so forth on self-help are generally successful. They offer some sort of therapy of our time, some sort of therapy for the people. And Jordan Peterson serves that interest. He talks about suffering a lot and offers some form of healing, and that is simply attractive to a lot of people. Now, he does so in a very eloquent way. He's smart, he's good looking, he comes across as authentic, he's oftentimes very emotional, he's overall an excellent performer, very smart. So he's just simply very good at what he's doing. Then, I guess, thirdly, probably he's also very media savvy. He's pretty good, or maybe his agents at marketing him, he can play the particularly social media very well. But of course, this is not all. Very importantly, he has become probably the most famous spokesperson for anti-political correctness, anti-wokeness. So people identify with someone like him who dares to say what they might not dare to say, who expresses very well what they cannot express, and who thereby acts like some sort of defender who takes on opponents in public that they can't. In addition to this, there's a strong moralistic element to what Peterson does. He sets up famously these two bogeymen, Marxists and postmodernists. And he not only sets them up as intellectual opponents, but as a threat to basically the well-being of individuals and the well-being of our society. And thereby, he appeals to some form of moral anger. Already Aristotle spoke about how effective that is. In this way, actually, I think he differs from Zizek, one of his major competitors, who uses much more humor. But anger might be even a more effective means of attracting attention and of getting support than humor. So he combines this heroic defender role and this moral anger, and this is important, with mythology and with religious elements. So there's a strong spiritual dimension to what he does. So he almost becomes something like a savior figure, like a warrior saint of our times. Now, what exactly does he promise to save? There's a short video entitled Jordan Peterson on Individualism on YouTube. We'll put a link on it in the description, where he's very clear about this. He promises to save nothing less than Western civilization. And his core thesis is that Western civilization is under threat. It's under threat by Marxists and postmodernists. And that's a very bad thing, because he thinks that modern Western civilization is the best civilization that ever existed. And he defines, and this is very important, individualism as its core characteristic. So ultimately, this means he saves us from the demise of not only Western civilization, but of our existence as individuals in a society that supports and embraces individualism. To understand Peterson's individualism, I recommend you watch this lecture, which you can find on YouTube, The Meaning and Reality of Individual Sovereignty. It's a very interesting lecture that I think reveals his individualist philosophy, which informs his psychology, and we have to mention that he's first and foremost a psychologist, but this individualist theory is at the core of his psychological practice. So in this lecture, interestingly, he starts with reflecting on the American Declaration of Independence as a core document that contains the core messages I would say, dogmas of Western civilization, and at its heart is individualism. So this clearly shows what I've said earlier in other videos, that he's firmly rooted in American civil religion. And by the way, I think he shares this with wokeism. It's just that he's of the opposite denomination of American civil religion. So he first and foremost embraces a certain dogma of individualism, which he sees at the center of specifically the North American civilization project. Now, in this very same lecture, he also goes further step back to one of his famous stories from the Old Testament in the Genesis, and thereby he provides a theological grounding to his notion of individualism. He goes back to this famous section in the Genesis where it is said that God made human beings in his own image. So Peterson reads this as saying the following. At this very early stage of the creation narrative, God had really not made much except creating order out of chaos. So according to Peterson, that God made humans in his own image just means that God has made humans as beings that have the basic capacity to create order out of chaos. So this leads to what I like to call Jordan Peterson's man-up psychology. It's a religiously grounded, existentialism-informed, man-up psychology. His famous paradigm, set your room in order, which means take on individual responsibility. And he thinks that this individualist taking charge of yourself and your situation is what all of society rests on. Now, Peterson is a psychologist, and I like to refer to another psychologist to set up a critique of Peterson's man-up psychology. I read it as a reaction to what I like to call, in connection with Sigmund Freud, the fourth insult to human vanity. Now let's talk about Freud's three insults to human vanity first. In his text on an introduction to psychoanalysis, Freud mentions three insults to human vanity. He says the first one was of a cosmological nature. Copernicus and others found out that the Earth is not at the center of the world. So this was a first insult to the centrality of human beings in creation. And of course that caused a lot of problems, and the people who came up with these insults, scientists, they got in a lot of trouble for it. Then secondly, Freud says there was a biological insult, and this is with Darwin. Namely, Darwin found out that humans are not the crown of creation, right? That we are not the beginning, but at the end point of a long, not creation, but evolutionary process. So that again diminishes the centrality and the primacy of human beings. And then Freud says, well, basically the third insult to human vanity comes through my own psychology, because I'm showing that the ego, the self, the rational ego, conscious selfhood, is not at the center of our psychological being. So the third insult is of a psychological nature. And it points out that the ego is relatively weak compared with the id, our drives, and also with the superego, the unconsciousness on the one hand and the social pressures on the other hand that dominate our personality. So we're not really fully in charge, consciously in charge of ourselves. Now, I would argue that by now there is also a fourth insult, namely a sociological or political insult. And you can tie this insult not only to the social theorist Niklas Luhmann, like I do, but you can also tie it to postmodernism. And this fourth sociological or political insult basically challenges the role of human primacy in the social or in the political realm. So we now begin to realize that also society is not steered by rational individuals. We're not fully in control of society. Rather than that, human agency too evolves, emerges, not completely unlike what Darwin found out regarding biological emergence of humans. So instead of being like fully in charge of ourselves, we live in a very complex social environment. With Deleuze, we could call it rhizomatic. There is a certain organic complexity also to social life. And it is this complexity that enables human agency rather than the other way around. So we now find that society is a complex multiplicity of different social spheres which we negotiate and which allow us to act, but which are not directly steered by individual human agents. And again, I think Peterson reacts precisely to this contemporary fourth postmodernist sociological political insult by defending individualism. I want to say a little bit about this sociological insult. And I think it also has something to do with Peterson's critique of Marxism and postmodernism. I think Marxism, one idea in Marxism, one that Peterson does not talk about, he criticizes other aspects of Marxism, but I think one central idea of Marxism is that the economy, the mode of production, is something that determines to an extent politics rather than the other way around. So already in the 19th century, Marx is basically challenging the idea that politics and politics alone is in charge. Rather than that, the way humans produce things, the economy, is informing certain political structures, and political structures arise on the basis or in support of certain economic structures. So this already diminishes the guiding role that we traditionally ascribe to politics. Now, in the 20th century, I think we see more and more theories that question the human capacity to control society through political agency, which is a central idea of modernity, which is a central idea of enlightenment. And again, in the 19th and 20th century, through Marxism, through some elements of Marxism, I have to say, and through more elements of postmodernism, this idea is challenged. And we find this, for instance, also in media theory, right? McLuhan, for instance, his theory is often summarized in the words that we shape our tools, we shape our technologies, we shape our media, but then in turn they shape us, right? So also with regard to media or technology, it's not the case that we are or could be even fully in charge of these technologies and the media, but it's through their use that new forms of agency arise. And then, of course, we have this much stronger in actual postmodernist thinkers like Debord or Baudrillard, just to look at the concepts like spectacle or hyperreality, that both point out that signs, symbols, language set up their own dynamics. And then this kind of hyper-reality informs social and political processes. So if we look at something like whatever, recent American elections or so, can be very much, I think, described in terms of Baudrillard or Debord as some form of hyper-real spectacle. It's not really the triumph of the mature, rational individuals that is represented in an American election, but it's rather the triumph of symbols, of symbolic gestures, the triumph of what could be called a simulacrum of politics. Politics just becomes a show. It's one great symbolic spectacle that fascinates people, but that doesn't really reflect the idea of rational individuals taking charge and taking control of themselves and transforming social disorder into social order through the act of politics. So I think social reality and social theory in the 19th and 20th century, and even more so in the 21st century, challenges Peterson's basic idea that sovereign individuals through governments can man up and take charge of society. That simply does not seem to be an accurate description of social reality in the 21st century. Instead, at least for me, it is much more convincing to conceive of society as multiple social orders. It's not chaos, but there are multiple social orders in the economy, in politics, media, even education. And these orders coexist, they co-evolve, they constantly change, they influence one another. But none of them is really a central governing system that really has all the others under firm control. And it's not the case that any of these systems or any of these social orders is controlled by single sovereign individuals. Again, it's rather the other way around, that individual agency becomes possible under the conditions and in negotiation with these systems. As Niklas Luhmann says it, steering is limited. There is no central agency like a government that can really steer society from chaos towards order. However, this is not really a problem. It is just perceived as a problem if you hold on to the control dogma. I mean, as with the previous three insults, right? The cosmos didn't fall apart just because the Earth isn't at the center, right? Similarly, just that humans are not the crown of the creation, that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with our bodies or that something wrong with evolution. Evolution theory isn't bad news for biology. And similarly, at least arguably, you can say that also the psychological complexity that we not simply consist of a rational ego that is in control, but that we also have drives and that there is also social influences, doesn't make life or human existence worse. It actually makes it much richer, arguably at least. And similarly, the sociological insult is not necessarily a problem. It's not the case that a society in which single individuals take charge would be necessarily better than a complex society where multiple social organisms, so to speak, continuously evolve and allow all kinds of different activities to become possible. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Nietzsche in this respect, because I think, at least from a philosophical perspective, this is perhaps the main problem with Jordan Peterson's approach, that he represents Nietzsche in such a way that Nietzsche becomes a spokesperson of his individualism. And I think that's it's a possible, but I still think it's a quite a misreading of Nietzsche and a reduction of him to an existentialist, which was in the early reception of Nietzsche a common thing. But I think now we've moved on since many decades and understood Nietzsche much more as a pre-postmodernist. So in one short section of The Twilight of the Idols, entitled of The Four Great Errors, Nietzsche comes up with a description of human existence that is very different from Peterson's individualism, and that basically makes it impossible to regard Nietzsche as someone who would somehow share Peterson's individualism. Nietzsche, in this section on the four great errors, speaks about four related great errors, and two of them are the error of false causality and the error of the imaginary cause. And this false imaginary cause for Nietzsche is precisely human will, human consciousness, or the human self, the I, the subject. He explains this with a kind of thought experiment. He says, look, people sleep and they hear a noise, maybe a cannon shot. And then they invent a story in which they become the cause of the noise, for instance, by firing a gun or something in their dream. So in this way, Nietzsche basically undermines individualism and points to a certain paradox, right? That we are, the individual and individual agency conceives of itself as a cause where it in fact is an effect. And somewhat similarly, a kind of a dialectical paradox of individualism has also been described by many 20th century thinkers. And I just mention a few here. For instance, Horkheimer and Adorno in their Dialectics of Enlightenment, where they also show how the supposedly most individualist country in the world, the United States in the 1950s, is at the same time also highly non-individualistic. American culture is mass culture, Hollywood, pop music, architecture, life in cars, right? There's a cookie-cutter uniformity to daily life. And in the economy, we have brands which make everything the same. So the most individualist country is at the same time the most conformist country with the most conformist culture. So this shows like an inbuilt paradox of authenticity and individualism. We learn to be authentic individuals by copying other authentic individuals. Elena Esposito, who I also referred to in earlier videos, has a wonderful lecture on fashion that I recommend, where she also points out how fashion very much expresses the same paradox, that we become original and we need to become original by copying certain fashions. And that is basically what fashion is. It is originality through non-originality. Again, as I mentioned earlier, McLuhan describes something similar with regard to the media. The medium is the message. So the medium is somehow that structures all the messages in somehow a conformist manner that are communicated through it. Conformity is imposed through a shared medium. And then get to Baudrillard, where he talks about copies without originals, about simulacra, which is a core notion of Baudrillard. That basically all the cultural symbols that constitute meaning in our world are such simulacra. They are copies without originals. So in this sense, the postmodern condition is a post-individualist condition, a condition in which the paradoxicality of individualism, in which individualism turns itself dialectically into conformity, becomes obvious. So instead of being sovereign individuals who express our unique selves, I think what actually we do today is we no longer develop identity in the form of authentic individuality, but as I said in other videos, we project and shape and create profiles and then hope for their validation. So this is much more postmodernist, but I think much more realistic concept of shaping individual identity. And Peterson is just trying to somehow make this transition from individualism to profilicity, to argue that it hasn't happened, or that it can stop, or that it must be reversed. So my final point is that Peterson also performatively contradicts himself, and that if we talk of something like, let's say, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, then we can see that this Jordan Peterson phenomenon already functions on the basis of profile building rather than on the basis of the sovereign individual. And I want to look just at one very short video clip, which is called Peterson Calls Out, the Pseudo-moralistic Stances of Activists. And it's from an Australian TV show in 2019. Actually, the video has more than 10 million viewers. And some person in the audience asked him how to actually save the world beyond just simply cleaning up one's room. And Peterson, as he often does, doesn't really answer the question directly, but deconstructs the questioner, kind of postmodernist strategy. And he makes here an interesting, actually quite harsh statement to contradict the questioner. He says, I think generally people have things that are more within their personal purview, that are more difficult to deal with and that they are avoiding, and that generally the way they avoid them is by adopting pseudo-moralistic stances on large-scale social issues so that they look good to their friends and their neighbors. So what Peterson does here, briefly put, is he accuses activism or wokeism of, number one, hiding personal issues, and then secondly, importantly, presenting highly moral public image of oneself, not just to friends and neighbors, but to public at large. And I think Peterson himself does exactly the same thing, right? I don't want to focus here on his tragic personal problems. The video, I think, was made shortly before his medication addiction was revealed, but I think that's not as important. That much more important is a second aspect, that what Peterson accuses the questioner here is something that I think perfectly also describes himself. He too is very much engaged in curating a positive public profile of himself, and I'm just quoting here, by adopting moralistic stances on large-scale social issues, right? Peterson adopts this very much moralistic posture of defending individualistic civilization, Western civilization, against its postmodernist and Marxist enemies who are somehow evil. That is obviously a large-scale social issue. So, in short, Peterson's individualism mirrors that kind of wokeist identity politics that he criticizes with his various reply to the questioner. I think he too represents the same original civil religion that wokeism split from. So Peterson is the individualism warrior who somehow corresponds to the wokeist identity warriors that he fights against. So this is really what could probably be called the Peterson paradox, that he's defending individualism at a time when the media production of identity, and specifically the media production of his own identity, contradicts this very message. Peterson's own prophilic identity works just in the same way that he ascribes to the questioner. I mean, he too projects simplistic moralistic stances, his individualist version of American civil religion, which is actually very similar to the moralistic stances of the wokeism people, the identity politics that he criticizes, and he projects it to large-scale social issues, the demise of Western civilization, saving the Western world, so that he looks good not only to his friends and neighbors, but to millions of followers who are just waiting for this message. Thereby, he obstructs rather than reveals, I think, a real insight into his actual topic, namely identity today. So I think, after all, one way of describing the Peterson phenomenon is as describing as a master of putting individualism in the service of profile building, of prophylicity. So again, to summarize one of the main points of this video, it seems to be clear to me that Jordan Peterson's individualism, somewhat paradoxically, is produced under the very postmodernist conditions described by theoreticians such as McLuhan, Baudrillard, Debord, and others. Jordan Peterson, just like anyone else, including myself, is projecting a public profile, is hoping for public validation, and is subjecting himself to second-order observation processes. He uses the traditional semantics of individuality and authenticity, but the social conditions within which he does this contradict this very semantics. In effect, he curates the Peterson brand, and he has no choice but to do this if he wants to be a successful media public intellectual.